east coast of the US, and I haven't seen them since December.
I think I'm live now. Yeah.
Ah.
Okay, right. Let me start. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Esther Scarpa from the State University of Campinas, Unicamp, here in Brazil. Welcome to another session of Abralinha ao Vivo, Linguists Online. Thank you for being here today for another great talk. In this series, I'm sure that the excellence of this talk will help to counterbalance the tensions and worries of these difficult times we are going through. Thank you, Miguel de Oliveira Jr., President of Abralinha, and Sandro Marengo for inviting me to moderate today's session. Before I continue, I must say that the event Abralinha ao Vivo, Linguists Online, is an initiative of the Brazilian the Associação Brasileira de Linguística, Abralinha, in cooperation with several international associations, among which the Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, the Associação de Linguística e Filologia da América Latina, AFAL, the Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, the Linguistic Society of America, the European Linguistic Society, the Linguists Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistic Society, among others. I have the pleasure and honor to introduce you to Professor Eve Clark, currently the Richard W. Lyman Professor of Humanities in Stanford University. It's not very easy to summarize her extensive curriculum vitae, in addition to the fact that she is very well known to generations of linguists and psychologists interested in language acquisition for the past 45 years. Her groundbreaking inspirational work on word meaning, assignment, acquisition, and development, has spanned for around 4.5 decades. Her editing and consulting activities are also very well known internationally. After her PhD studies at the University of Edinburgh, she moved to the United States and pursued a very successful career at the University of Stanford. She has published numerous books and articles that have exerted a definite influence in the studies of language acquisition and cognition, mainly connected to lexical acquisition. Professor Clark's general view is that there is interplay between cognitive domains and the acquisition and development of the lexicon in a multifactorial and multifaceted interactive way, both in early and later acquisition. Her work shows how children go from concept formation to mapping meaning into words, and how the interface between words and morphosyntactic information is carried on. This is implemented both by English-speaking and cross-linguistic and across children studies that look at the acquisition principles of word formation that stem from, now I quote, pragmatic information offered by adults to children in conversation, and reversely, how, quote again, how children make use of adult input to discern underlying structure of the system. Now, in a more anecdotal touch, she was one of the sources of inspiration for me in the 70s when I chose language acquisition as an area for my PhD. That's when I came across an article by Professor Clark with the suggestive name of What's in a Word. That was then contrary or complementary view of the list of strict compositional features that encompassed simple lexical fields at the most. I knew then, and as I know now, that the path for meaning and lexical acquisition, as with any other area in language acquisition, was a long and complex one. Now I hand over to Professor Eve Clark, whom I thank warmly for having accepted the invitation to give this conference. The title of her presentation is How Repairs in Conversation Guide the Acquisition of Language. Questions will be answered after the talk, and please I remind you that write down your questions on the chat section of this video. Now, Professor Clark.
All right, I will get my screen ready. My goal today is to look at the role of conversational repair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. To look at the role of conversational repair in the process of acquiring a first language. I've become very interested in the last few years in how the interaction between speakers, in fact, helps inform children. So what do I mean by a repair? Speakers use repairs all the time to fix any kinds of misunderstanding and problems that they have as they're talking, as in this example, where the child says, he fall, adult says, what? So that's a request for a repair. And the child then elaborates a little and says, he falling down. Repairs are specific. I'm going to look at repairs that are specific to talk in conversational exchanges. You also get repairs in gesture, but I'm not going to cover those at all today. Repairs can be unprompted. And so we can call these self-initiated self-repairs. And I might say, I'm going to Maandag, where there is a break in the word and then a repair of the prepositional phrase that I was trying to say. Or repairs can be prompted, where they're initiated by someone else and then either repaired by that person or repaired by the person who made the error. So if A says, I'm going to live tomorrow. What? I'm going to leave tomorrow. So there the vowel was wrong. And after the prompt, the speaker repairs it. In 1977, Shegloff, Jefferson, and Sachs, in their paper on repairs in conversation, pointed out that there was an organization of repair that operates in conversation addressed to recurrent problems in speaking, hearing, and understanding. This mechanism produces a strong skewing in which self-repair predominates over other repair, revealing a strong preference for self-repair. So what I want to show today is that this preference for self-repair holds as strongly for small children as it does for adults. And for all speakers, the skewing that Shegloff observed follows other initiated requests for repair. In children, you find both prompted and unprompted repairs emerging very early, from about age 1 onwards. So this tells you how early this is. Why? Well, children don't yet know the language. They're learning it. They're seizing on words and phrases, storing them in memory, and then later retrieving them to use for recognizing the words from other people, and also to use them as targets when they're trying to use those words themselves in speaking. But almost all children's early speech contains errors, and adults often fail to understand them. And so the adults prompt children for repairs. And a child might say, wabwe, you want what? One bwe, that's bread, just in case. And so the child, in responding to the prompt, tries to improve at least the verb want by adding the nasal, but still doesn't fix the word bread. In a 2015 study by Mark Dingermanser and numerous colleagues, they looked at the types of initiation for prompting repairs across a large number of languages, and they found there were 3 universal types of initiator. The first one I want to talk about are open requests. So B says, can I have that? Huh? B louder, can I have that book? So open requests, in English at least, are marked by huh, what. And these query the whole utterance, but they're not specific about what's wrong with the utterance that they're querying. You also get restricted requests. So C says, did you see that man with a boxer? That man with a what? That man with a boxer dog. So this speaker adds more information in case A doesn't know what a boxer is. And these are prompts that include the words what, where, who, when. So all the WH words that we can use in questions, basically. And these query one particular part of the utterance. The third, universal types, apologies. The third type that you see are what are called restricted offers. D says, see that? He ran across the road. He ran across the road? Yes. These query the whole utterance. Notice they have rising intonation over that, and that's asking the first speaker for confirmation, whether this is what the speaker said or not. These 3 prompt types appear to be universal. So open requests, restricted requests, and restricted offers. They are really frequent in adult conversations, about every 1.4 minutes, according to Dingermanser and his colleagues, regardless of the language being spoken. So this tells you that this is a very frequent interactional resource, but it's one that we're often not particularly aware of when we're having a conversation, because repairs occur immediately after the problem and it gets fixed and you go on and you remember the general content, but not the absolute details of the form. Adults prompt children when they don't understand them with both open and restricted requests. So you get huh, he went where. They check explicitly on what children mean with restricted offers. And these are the kinds of prompts that I'm going to look at in detail in this talk. The restricted offers, which in our own research we had called reformulations when we first came across them quite a while ago now, as initiators of repair, serve children in 2 ways. First of all, they provide an utterance that contrasts with the child's preceding utterance, and they present the child with adult forms of what they seem to intend. So there are sort of two faces, if you like, to these restricted offers or reformulations. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is first talk about some of the data on unprompted spontaneous self-repairs, then turn to prompted self-repairs and look at open requests and child repair types, restricted requests and child repair types, then go on to look in some detail at restricted offers, how these reformulate what the child appears to mean, and how children respond to these offers. And then I will end with 2 glances at case studies of restricted offers for some French verb uses and for some early Hebrew verb uses. Okay, so here is the first section. With unprompted spontaneous self-repairs, the child has a goal in talking, and that is to get the other person to understand. To do this, the child must produce recognizable words, and this is, in fact, a very ambitious goal, if you like, if you take a 1 or 1.5-year-old. The self-repairs they produce depend on the child's ability to monitor for mismatches between adult forms that the child has stored in memory and the child forms that the child is producing as he or she speaks. When children monitor for mismatches, we're starting first from forms that they have heard from adults and have stored in memory. And they use these forms to recognize words when they hear them again from those adults or other adults. Children try to use stored adult forms as targets for their own speech as well. And they monitor their own speech against these stored forms. And when they detect a mismatch, they very often try again. And you will hear this as multiple attempts at a particular word when they are very young. Let me give you an example from Ronald Scollan's work in 1976, where he studied a 1.5-year-old called Brenda. And on one occasion, she tried the word fan. She made 5 attempts at it before her mother recognized the target. And I've given you the transcription here. So fan, So here you have an open request. Child tries again, adds a little nasalization. Mother guesses bathroom. Child emphatically adds a nasal and then just a bit of nasalization in 2 more tries. And the mother at that point recognizes and says, fan, yeah. And then Brenda says what she wanted to say about the fan, namely cool. Mother says, cool, yeah, fan makes you cool. And so by doing that, taking up what the child said and also giving a nice expansion of it with fan makes you cool, she confirms her understanding of that first word and then the second contribution that the child made. On another occasion, Brenda tried the word shoe. She was holding up her mother's shoe, looked at it and said, mama, 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 shish, shoo, shoosh. And mother got it and said, shoes. Now with each attempt at adult shoe, Brenda was adjusting her production until her mother confirmed she'd understood the word that Brenda was trying to say. A case of car is an even more interesting one in that she made 4 attempts at the word car unsuccessfully, then 2 attempts at the word go, and then 9 attempts at the word bus. The child was hearing a car passing in the street. The adult didn't hear it at the time. And so the adult, after the 4 versions of car, said, what? Brenda says, go, go. Second adult who was there said something they couldn't transcribe. Then Brenda started in on her versions of bus. And the adult said, what? Oh, bicycle? Is that what you said? No, no, no. No, I got it wrong, and laughed. Now, when Scollan was transcribing this tape the next day, he could hear the sound of an engine on the road outside the house. And at that point, the whole thing became transparent to him, and he realized that what she was saying, namely car, go, and bus. So what you see is that there may be cases where children really fail, despite their attempts to fix their erroneous forms. The focus of most of children's early unprompted repairs is in fact phonology. So they will add final consonants, and I have here mainly examples from English, so cat to cat, be to bed. They adjust medial and final consonants, so you get babbit for basket, which gets corrected to backet for basket. Clusters like SK take longer. Fis for fish, runk for rug. They adjust vowels. Whoops. Sorry. They adjust vowels. So they don't wear clothes to be to bed. Adding syllables. That's a flower basket. So they add a whole syllable there. Morphology becomes the focus a little later as they start to add inflections. So with verbs in English, the ing is one of the earliest forms that gets added. So he come to he coming out. There isn't any, there aren't any. So that's a correction for number. They also fix verb forms. So I sticked it in, I stuck it in. This was a slightly older child. You know what they ate of, eat out of. And they pick the appropriate pronoun, gender, and case. It's he's too big. She has a silly putty like me had, like I did. Syntax is a focus later still because there's very little syntax when you only have one or two word utterances, if any syntax at all at that time. So they will change their subject. So the child might start out saying, that's, he gave you that meat. So clearly realizing that, say, that meat is what he gave you is a much more complex construction than the one the child opted for in making that repair. He put the fish into a flower pot. So you can change the subject, you can change the word order, as in these examples, and you can add elements. So all gone, frog, all gone, stand up, cat, stand up, table, or Kristen, sit chair. They also add modifiers. These animals, all these animals are small. They fill in for pronouns with a full reference. So it got, the wheel got out. He has splinters in him, that animal. This is really like a topicalization in French or Portuguese or Italian. And they also make unprompted repairs to their word choices. This is extremely common from the very beginning. And I've just given you a few examples. As they get older, they may even add little markers that say, I'm explicitly making a repair like I mean. So here, Angeffia's, I mean Antonia's blue, or they have little, I mean big turtle hands. When we originally studied this, we had recordings from 3 children who went up in age, and these were the numbers of spontaneous repairs that they made where there was no adult prompt. And if you just look at the percent, you can see that for Sean, the youngest, phonology and lexical repairs were the most common. If you go to the next child, very few phonological repairs, but she was starting to make many more repairs to her lexical choices and some repairs to syntax. And the oldest child had the same pattern. Now we can break down across these 3 children just by age and look at the display of this. And we see that up till a little past 2.5, it's phonology is dominant with morphology coming in and lexical choices are there all the way through. From about a bit over 2.5, you see that syntax starts to come in and gets a bit more frequent. But these are still very young children. So what I want to do now is turn to prompted other initiated self-repairs and look at what sorts of repairs they make, under what circumstances they make them, and how attentive they are to these prompts. So with open requests, remember we have and or what, restricted requests like the dog ran where, and restricted offers like the boy hit the ball. Is that what you really said? So these are some examples taken from a fairly young child, 9, and he was putting a puzzle together and asking his mother whether it fits. And he says, see, he's trying to say incy, as in the rhyme in English, incy wincy spider. And the mother says, huh? Child still positioning the same piece of puzzle. See there? Incy there. And at that point, the mother gets it and she says, well, no, not quite like that. Pull it down. So Robin's original attempt was the word incy, which was the picture of a spider on the puzzle piece. And then he elaborated it and said incy there. And that made clearer to his mother what he was talking about. A few minutes later, still on this puzzle, he was positioning a piece which had a picture of a clock on it. And he says, Adida, which was, we can gloss after the fact of saying there, tick-tock. Mother looked across at Robin and the puzzle and said, Robin continues to position the puzzle piece. De quoi? And the mother at that point said the clock goes there. So what he'd said originally was there tick-tock, and then he elaborated and said there something like cluck, and then corrected it to clock. He didn't have the final k on it, but he had something which was closer to the right vowel. Adults, it turns out, use a range of prompts with their children, and in this study by Juliet Corrin, the mother made open requests to rerun the utterance, like what, huh? Restricted requests, doggy's where, it's a what, and restricted offer. The child says doggy gone, and the mother says the doggy's gone. So notice she added rising intonation, and she added an article and an auxiliary. There's also what she called a retry initiator, which was not very effective. And so the mother asks, what's the boy carrying? Child says, boy there. So clearly has not understood the question. And so the mother tries again and says, what's he got in his hand? Child didn't get that one either. Later, what's the boy carrying? It's a stick. And then the mother corrects and says, no, it's not a stick, and goes on. But overall, this child responded to nearly 80% of the maternal prompts that he heard. So this suggests that children pay close attention to these kinds of prompts. When we look at some other studies, like Tanya Gallagher's, we find that 69% of other initiated prompts to 2-year-olds take a particular form. That is, they are restricted offers, and that's what I'm going to focus on most in this talk. Experimental elicitation studies have shown similar findings. In these studies, what you have is an adult with a child, 1 hour recording, and every few minutes the adult says, huh, or what? And then you look to see what the child does in response. So this, it turns out in an hour, you do this about 20 times, and then you can analyze the results. So what Gallagher found was that children would revise their original utterance after a prompt. So a child might say something like, big ball, what? It a big ball. So that's a revision of the original utterance. Or they might just repeat their utterance, sometimes more loudly. So a child might say, big ball, what? Big ball. And if we look at Gallagher's data, we see that children repeated, these are the age groups that she looked at, repeated between 13–26%, but most of the time, over 2/3 of the time, they revised their original utterance when they were prompted. And this is further evidence that children attend to these sorts of requests for repair. You also find these WH words in open and restricted requests. So you get full repeats like, as in this one, I want milk, what? I want milk. Or put milk glass, what? Put milk in glass. So the child adds a preposition and expands that. Or you might get a, sorry. Sorry, I've lost. Okay. Or you might get a restricted answer. I want milk. You want what? Milk. Put milk in glass. Put milk where? In glass. Sometimes you get no response and the parent just repeats the question, but usually in different forms. So what do you want? You want what? Where will I put it? Put it where? And sometimes you get restricted answers after restricted requests. I want it. You want what? Milk. Put milk there. Put the milk where? In cup. So with all of these restricted forms, you find children most of the time take them up and give you a reasonable response, namely one that you can, as an adult, that you can understand. Now, when we turn to restricted offers, and I'll sometimes call these reformulations, we find that they cover two types of adult prompt. They cover prompts in what have been called side sequences, and they cover prompts in what have been called embedded corrections. Side sequences ask for confirmation of the intended meaning while supplying missing or incorrect elements. And they're called side sequences because they're a step aside from the main line of the conversation so that you can fix a little problem, and then you step back to the main conversation again. So in this adult example, A says, now, do you and your husband have a car? And B wasn't quite sure what A said and said, have a car? Yeah. So A confirms, and then B answers the original question and says, no. And notice that have a car has rising information as B seeks confirmation of what it was that A actually said. Notice A started with J, presumably for Jeep, but then changed immediately back to the word car. If we look at a side sequence in a child-adult exchange, we can see cases where the child uses a single word, milk, milk. And the father checks up by saying in the side sequence, you want milk? And Abe says, uh-huh. So he confirms, yes. And then the father steps back to the main line of the conversation, says, okay, just a second and I'll get you some. So what the father's done is add you and want. This is an adult form for Abe's request with rising intonation. So he's asking the child to confirm that that is what he intended to say. Now, embedded corrections, the second type of restricted offer, replace a wrong word with a new one. The original speaker then uses the new word in the next utterance. Another example from the conversational literature, customer is looking for a piece of piping and says, the whales are wider apart than that. And the salesman says, okay, let me see if I can find one with wider threads, which is actually the right word for the indentations around the end of a pipe. How's this? The customer says, nope, threads are even wider than that. So what you've got always with embedded corrections is this ABB pattern where you go from whales used by the first speaker, threads as a correction, tacit correction, and then the uptake of threads by the original speaker. And here we can see an example from a child-adult exchange. Child is being carried and says, don't fall me downstairs. And father says, oh, I wouldn't drop you downstairs. And child immediately picks up on it and says, don't drop me downstairs in the next utterance. So again, you've got this ABB pattern, fall, drop, drop. Okay, the general communicative goal when adults use restricted offers is to check on the meaning that's intended by the child. And of course, as their language gets more complex, but they're still making errors, this is an important element in any conversational exchange. So the pattern that you see is that the child makes an error. The adult reformulates the child's utterance in adult form in the next turn to check on the child's meaning with rising intonation. That is this what you mean? And the child displays uptake in various ways, with a repeat of the corrective form, with an acknowledgement, or with a continuation that presupposes acceptance of the adult offer. If we look at the number of reformulations of child errors by age, what we did was take 5 longitudinal corpora, so over between 2 and 3 years each, from these children with weekly recordings. And we simply went through all the corpora and we marked every single error we saw. Then we looked to see what the adult said next, and then what the child said in the third turn. What we found was that between 2 and 2.5, adults reformulate child errors about 60% of the time. From 2.5 to 3, this starts to drop a little bit. By 3 to 3.5, it's down to about 45%, and it's around 36% from 3.5 to 4. This, by the way, is a very high rate of correction, if you like, when you compare it to learning studies in psychology, where they reckon that a 12% feedback rate on errors is usually enough for you to learn long word lists. If we look at it by type of error, we find that phonology and phonological lexical repairs are the commonest forms corrected in these restricted offers. Morphology, not quite so often. Syntax, a little bit more. But there were no statistically significant differences among these types. That is, all of them were being corrected in all the children. And we can take one child and just look at his errors reformulated by age. Here, the parents reformulated Abe's errors 67% of the time when he was 2 to 2.5. And that dropped to nearly half for 2.5 to 3.5, and then dropped a little bit more again after 3.5. The white bars on this graph are simply cases where parents repeated exactly what Abe had said. Again, this was confirming things. So it's like when you say, what do you want? And you say a beer, and your interlocutor confirms with saying a beer. All right. If we look at the percentage of adult reformulations that are offered in side sequences for our 3 English corpora, we found for Abe, it was 57%, Sarah 70%, Naomi 70%. In the 2 French corpora we looked at, 73% for Philippe, and Grégoire was 62%. All the other reformulations that adults used were embedded corrections. So clearly side sequences, in fact, are favored about for 2/3 of the time, and embedded corrections the rest of the time. Now, what happens when children reply to these restricted offers? Let me take a couple of examples from our French data first. This child at 2.2 pronounced the word for tire in French as ne. Il a des nœuds le camion. And the mother corrects and says, oui, il a des pneus, pneu. And so she emphasizes the pronunciation of the word, and then the child picks it up and says pneu. So he takes up the pronunciation on that occasion. With another child, tu l'as vu, you saw it. Oui, j'ai vu un lapin. Now, what the child does, just use a schwa instead of a nasalized un for the article here. And the mother immediately corrects again and says, oui, tu as vu un lapin. And she emphasizes the article. With morphology, you get all sorts of reformulations. So this child at 2.4 saying, he falled again, where this is an over-regularized past tense. And the father says, okay, he fell, but no, he's at the boat, and they go on. They have a big pretend play sequence here. Another child says, baker, puts a bowl on his head, baker, baker. And father checks, you're a baker. And so adding a pronoun, an auxiliary, and an article. An older child, it might get loosed down the plug hole. And the adult says, lost down the plug hole. And in correcting the past tense, but uses this rising intonation to check, is that what you meant? With the lexicon, we've looked at this fall drop example, so let me skip to the next one. Child with toothbrush in hand says, am I going to tease? The mother puzzled, oh, you mean you're going to pretend to do your teeth? Yes. Father coming to the room, are you going to do your teeth? No, I was just pretending. So there's this immediate uptake of this new verb as an embedded correction here in the reformulation. And syntax, child is putting cars away in his garage, and he says, les mettre dans le garage. And the adult says, il faut les mettre dans le garage. You need to put them in the garage. And she's got added a pronoun and a modal verb. And the child picks up faut les mettre dans le garage. So he takes it up. And here, this child, slightly older, is trying something very complex in French, which many French speakers would avoid anyway. Quoi que tu fais penser means, I think that you need to think about this. And mother glosses as, faudra que je t'y fasse penser. D'accord. So she is actually confirming here, but she gives a much more complex construction with a future modal and a subjunctive in the next verb, as well as adding the relevant pronouns, 3 of them. And this, I think, was just simply beyond the child at that time. But if we look at how children respond to adult reformulations in general, we find that 56% of the time, they simply continue on that topic. That is, they tacitly accept the adult's interpretation and go on. But 18% of the time, they repeat the form that has been corrected. 21% of the time, they acknowledge it with yes. And about 5% of the time, they reject the interpretation and typically then try again. So here's a repeat of an adult repair in a restricted offer. This is from a 1.5-year-old, and she says "tu" for tourne, meaning spin. The mother says "tourne, oui." Elle tourne la toupie. The top is spinning, and the child tries again and says "tourne." So she's repeating the verb. She still doesn't have any R's. And so if we look at her original, we see this form of the verb, and then she elaborates it, and you can see she has added the N. A repeat of an adult repair. Here, light here, says the child, there's another light. And child says, light a hall, pointing at the overhead light. And the adult says, light in the hall. Light in a hall. And the adult says, there's a light in the hall. So again, gives the full article as well as the preposition. So child original just has a schwa here. Child elaboration has light in a preposition, but still keeps this schwa for the. You get acknowledgements in the form of no or but this one is more complex. A wanted to have his orange peeled, fix it. You want me to peel it? So here we have a side sequence, but also a particular verb being offered. And Abe, having agreed that that's what he wanted, he then actually repeated the verb itself and said, peel it. Okay, that's given you a quick sort of overview of studies of restricted offers. And I want to look at two case studies now. One of class 1 verbs used in French. These are verbs that end in ER in the infinitive. It's the largest class of verbs in French. It has some of the commonest verbs belong in class 1. If you coin a new verb in French, you always put it into class 1. Children start to produce forms of class 1 verbs very early. But they produce many forms like donner as single word utterances, and you have no idea whether the child is using the infinitive, donner, meaning to give, or the past participle, donner, meaning given. These are homophones. They sound identical. There is no way to distinguish them in speech. You have to have a bit more information. At this stage, children produce present tense verb forms for ongoing events. And so tombe, he's falling, present tense, but usually without any pronoun. And they produce many of these forms like tomber for future or anticipated events versus past completed events. So this is where, as I said, you don't know whether it's the infinitive or the past participle. They don't yet produce any modal or auxiliary verbs. So you don't get things like il peut tomber, he could fall, or il est tombé, he fell. And you don't get any subject pronouns at this point. And so when adults are listening to children at this stage, they have to take into account the timing of children's utterances in context. And they then make restricted offers with respect to the probable event the child's referring to. So their restricted offers will add modal verbs if the event is one that's anticipated, and they'll add auxiliary verbs if the event is already completed. So let me give you a concrete example. The child is holding a doll at the edge of the table and says sauter. And the adult immediately says il peut sauter. So the adult here offers a modal plus infinitive form because the event hasn't yet occurred. That is, the doll has not jumped. The second case, the child is looking at a doll on the floor, and the child says sauté, and the adult says oui, il a sauté. He jumped. And so here the adult offers an auxiliary plus past participle form because the event has already occurred. That is, the doll is already on the floor and therefore must have jumped, according to the child. So what we did was we had videotapes so we could see what was happening, and we had detailed transcriptions of all the child's utterances as well as the recordings. And so we looked at all the cases where the child used these single word verb forms, and we then looked to see how the adult glossed them. And for ER verbs, and I've given as your example, veut donner here, if it's an anticipated event, then 65% of the time adults use a modal and infinitive construction. 35% of the time they just use the present tense. This is okay for future events in spoken French. But if the event was completed, this child's mother used auxiliary plus past participle 97% of the time. So this is giving it's a very direct way of pulling apart these two forms of the verb with respect to whether it's future or past. Gael, a second child we looked at, you don't see quite such a clear-cut distinction, but again, the anticipated forms, the adults use modal and infinitive 56% of the time, present 44% of the time. With completed events, again, the majority are auxiliary plus past participle, 67%, but it's not quite such a striking distinction as it was for Camille. However, both of these are highly significant results statistically. Now, these adult offers provide two kinds of information. They provide negative information, so what's wrong, that is, you can't use sauter or tomber alone. And they give positive information. That is, if you're anticipating the action, you use a modal and the infinitive. And if the action is completed, you use an auxiliary and the past participle. And we'll see that we get the same sort of thing happening with Hebrew with actually much younger children. We looked at data from children between 1 and 2.5 for the most part. And we looked at their early verbs. Now in Hebrew, you have the problem that the stem consists of 3 consonants, occasionally just 2. And then there is a very elaborate inflectional system that tells you what conjugation the verb belongs to, whether you have a masculine or feminine form, what person it is, and whether it's singular or plural. So that's just the minimum. There are some other elaborations on there, which I'm not even going to mention. And what you find is very few of verb forms are transparent, where the target verb is identifiable, but typically mispronounced. This is very rare in any forms between age 1 and 1.5. That is, most of the verbs children produce are opaque. That is, they're unclear or they're ambiguous in context. Many of these are truncated forms that are based on the infinitive. So you get something like chol, from leechol, to eat. You also get forms where the inflectional affixes and any derivational affixes have been omitted. And so here I've given you some examples where the adult says, mata ose, what are you doing? And the child says, pes, which basically means climb. Adult, meta pes al hashulchan, are you climbing on the table? But pes itself could have been based on lots of different forms. So letapes, to climb, the infinitive, netapes, climbing, first plural. So, we're climbing, or yetapes, will climb, singular, masculine, and so on. And there's no way to tell what particular form the child had in mind. So what the parent does is look at what the child is doing and then asks what seems like the most reasonable question. So parents, again, are taking the physical context into account in trying to come up with a reasonable offer. Children also produced some inflected but unanalyzed verb forms. So here the child produces matzat, found, which is second singular feminine. But since she's referring to herself, she shouldn't be saying you found, she should be saying I found, which would be the form matzati. Another child who, when she referred to her baby brother, would say things like bocha, is crying, but this is the third singular feminine form, and what she needs for her baby brother is boche, is crying, third singular masculine. So the agreement there still needs to be fixed. And what happens is that adults very often reformulate these child forms in the next turn using the same verb. So when the child says something like tach, meaning roughly speaking open, the adult says mat osa liftoach, what are you doing? Are you opening it? Or achshav akum ima, now get up mummy, but akum is not really anything except that it has the K and the M consonants in there, and the adult says atrotsa lakum, you want to get up, where lakum is the infinitive. So what we did was look at all the verb forms produced by 4 children. When adults didn't reformulate immediately after the child's use, they would elaborate on what the child seemed to mean, generally using either the same verb or a semantically related one, again, often in the infinitive. And so here you can get a sense of how many forms we looked at, a lot from every child. Adult reformulations, between 50 and 70% of the time, they reformulated, added various inflections, corrected the inflections. And the rest of the time, they would elaborate. So they would talk about what the event the child seemed to be focused on, but they didn't always use, they sometimes used the same lexeme, sometimes something different, but semantically related. So children are getting feedback immediately after their use, well over 90% of the time, in this very early stage of using verbs in Hebrew. As children added inflections for person, gender, number, and tense, the adults began using fewer infinitive forms in their restricted offers, and they also reduced the number of prompts they offered. So what's important here is that the repairs in all these reformulations flag the errors that children make and simultaneously present them with adult ways of saying what they apparently intended. So what can we conclude here? Repairs in conversation are an important source, an important resource for children mastering the forms and constructions of their first language. And why? All of them flag children's errors, and most offer the correct, that is the adult form that you would expect to hear used. So adult repairs in restricted offers provide extensive feedback that is both negative and positive in the absolute next turn within the conversational exchange. The negative feedback, with restricted offers, you're identifying the errors that children have made, and you do it by producing a contrasting utterance immediately after the child has finished speaking. As far as positive feedback is concerned, these offers present the right way, if you like, to express the meaning that the child appeared to intend. So it's the error feedback form, and then the child's possible uptake that is important. Now, to make any sort of repair, children have to monitor both their own speech and the speech of others. This monitoring will depend on the children's representations in memory for adult word forms, because first, these enable recognition when they hear a word again from someone else. But these representations also serve as targets for the child's own speech. We saw that self-monitoring begins early, often around age 1, or between 1 and 1.5. And this self-monitoring enables spontaneous self-repairs. And we looked at some examples of those. But other monitoring also begins very early, again around age 1, and it tends to prompts for repair and leads to self-repairs. So these are both very important aspects of how the repair system works. Children monitor their own speech for mismatches with forms they already have stored in memory, and when they detect a mismatch, they try to repair it. This is what adults do automatically. We don't produce speech errors so often, but if you listen to tapes and transcribe them in great detail, you find that people, if they can, immediately repair any errors they've made as they're talking. And of course, people differ enormously. There is one lecturer I know in biology at Stanford who can give an hour-long talk at high speed and does not make a single speech error. I've never heard anyone else like it. Most people make a certain number of speech errors as they're going along, but they repair them. And as long as they get the repair made so that the content is clear to the addressee, then people typically don't remember what speech error you actually made. With open requests, these are things like huh and what. Children correct word forms and word choices. They add missing words, or they repeat what they had said more loudly. With restricted requests, they correct or add to specific word choices. But it's with restricted offers that you see children sort of, if you like, responding in a more complex way, and that very often they repeat the repair that they've heard, they acknowledge it, or they continue on topic and thereby tacitly acknowledge the adult repair. But all of this, the fact that children make spontaneous self-repairs and that they make other initiated self-repairs says they are taking notice of this information that they're being offered in the course of conversation. When they make repairs, they repair phonology, they change their pronunciation, they repair morphology, they add inflections and function words, they repair syntax, for instance, changing word order, subject choice. They repair their word choices, but building up a vocabulary takes quite a lot of time, and producing the right words takes lexical knowledge, which is, and this, you could say, is a lifelong effort, but most people have reached their adult-like vocabulary by about age 18. So this is a process that goes on for much longer. Now, why do adults make use of open and restricted requests and restricted offers? They do it to smooth the course of the conversational interaction between adult and child. These sorts of repairs that are requested are integral to the smooth to and fro of conversation. Adults make extensive use of open and restricted requests and restricted offers in exchanges where you've got an adult who is an expert in the language, relatively speaking, and a child who is learning it and is at some stage in that process of learning. So what I would like to argue is that these requests for clarification and repair play a really important role in children's discovery of the forms of their language. That is, what is the appropriate thing to say on this occasion if this is what I mean? And I should like to point back to a paper from some 50 years ago by Roger Brown, who was my model when I started working on language acquisition, that the changes produced in sentences as they move between persons in discourse may be the richest data for the discovery of grammar. And with that, I will end. Thank you. Okay.
The sound right. Do you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Clark. I I have here lots of questions. They were done in
Okay.
Portuguese, but
Good.
I can translate them to
Okay,
you.
yes.
Let's start with Carmen Silva. In your research, have you observed some reformulations related to uses and exchange of persons, speech discourse persons, I, you, and he or she? I mean, so the personal pronouns, I mean.
Yeah. We haven't looked explicitly at that. I've done other work on those pronouns, and those are things that are very difficult to correct. And it's not, sometimes you get parents saying, if the child says, you threw the ball, the parent will say, no, you mean I threw the ball. And they will say, you mean, as a preface to it. But I think the work I found most interesting on this is by Takani Oshima at Montreal. And what she did was look at first children versus second, third, fourth children in families. And it turns out that nearly all of the IU errors where children use you to refer to themselves and I to refer to the speaker, that is, they don't shift, occurred in firstborn children. And they would make this error up until somewhere between 2.5 and 3. But she found the secondborn children very rarely made that kind of error. And she thought it was because the secondborn are seeing interchanges between their older sibling and adults where they hear the shifting of the pronouns all the time. And so they pick up on that shifting character and so don't make those errors. But I don't think that there is, I don't remember in particular looking at reformulations that focused on that.
Okay. There's another question here. Oh, that's it's a question related to lockdown, social distancing.
Oh, okay.
Do you think that this new context can interfere in interaction and between children and adults, and consequently in the production comprehension of the reformulations that was done by Alessandra Deltre? I
don't know. I can only offer an anecdote in response. My son's a biologist. They have two children. A 9-year-old who is happily doing her distance schooling on Zoom, except she misses her friends, and a 3-year-old who normally is in a little play group with about 8 other children and hasn't seen them now for 2.5, 3 months. And the 3-year-old is intent on having as much pretend play as she can extract from her parents when they're there. So I think there is a lot of interaction there. And of course, her older sister plays with her too. But it is different, and it depends how long this lasts. It is going to have an effect on children, but whether it will have any sort of visible effect on the patterns of acquisition, I really can't say.
There's another question here by Camila Rossetti Vieira. There are longitudinal studies in which the parents are the only researcher.
Yes, right.
And is there a bigger or smaller tendency for the correction to take place? Or you haven't seen this? I mean,
I haven't. And, this is a really interesting question because, again, I will give you a little anecdote. I kept a diary study of my son from birth until age 6, when he clearly realized what I was doing and I just stopped. But I was not focusing at all on that aspect of language interaction. All the time I kept those diary notes. And much later, I started working with Michel Chouinard, and we looked at several of the corpora in the child's archive. And we saw this, and later when I went back and looked at some of my diary data, I saw, yes, that's in there. But I don't think that the incidence was any different from anywhere else. So it's interesting because if you point out to parents that they are doing this, they will say, oh yes, of course I do it because he said it wrong, or I needed to be sure that I understood him. And in fact, usually I've had comments about understanding the child, which is why I think this is the sort of primary function of these things for the adult. But of course, it gives them both negative and positive feedback in doing that.
Right. There's another questions about prosody. This was by Mariani Cavalcanti. Which is the role or the effect of the prosodic emphasis that is marked during the strategies of repairs or reformulation on the child's speech, or vice versa, putting the adult speech for the child. Is it possible to think about these effects, this prosodic effect on the formulation as well?
Well, the prosodic effect seems to be that in the restricted offers, adults, if it's a side sequence, adults use rising intonation, which is standard for side sequences. But notice that rising intonation, at least in English and French, well, French in a slightly different way, marks it as a question. So the parent is asking for confirmation of some sort of this interpretation. With the embedded corrections, that seems to be a little different. And in talking to children, parents may emphasize the new word they're offering instead of the one the child used. In adult conversation, it seems to be done pretty seamlessly, and there doesn't seem to be necessarily any emphasis on the new word. It's just the person uses it, and because they are regarded as someone who knows what the right word is, it gets picked up in the next turn by the original speaker. So I think prosodic marking can be very important, and sometimes people will use the wrong word and they will be corrected by someone who just says the right word very loudly with emphasis. And they always realize what it is. But I don't, it's not clear how much of that really goes on in adult-child interaction.
Okay. I have two people asking about what do children do about the correction. One asks that is there a guarantee that the child will really correct the repair? And the other one, have you compared, that says the same thing approximately, have you compared repaired against not repaired speech? After correcting, do children make the same error again later on? Is there a guarantee?
Yeah. No, this is actually, it's a really important question, and I think that it's important to notice that children do, when they repeat what the correction was, obviously they have picked up on what it was and are trying it out. That does not guarantee in any way that the next time they come up with that form, they produce it incorrectly, because it's not a matter of instantaneous learning. Once you have started to produce a form one way, you have to reset all your articulatory patterns. and how you're going to deal with this word in the future. And this takes time. Children may be well aware that they're using the wrong form, but they aren't necessarily able to come up with the right form when they're trying to say it themselves. One little test of this is to start using the child's wrong form yourself as the adult. They get extremely angry with you. And they say, you don't say that. And if you then push them, say, well, what do I say? With some difficulty, they can get to it. But it's much more effort than using the form as they've used it up till now, which is the erroneous one. So I think that what's important to note here is that learning a lot of these forms takes a lot of time. And there's been some experimental work on this by Matthew Saxton, Saxton, and he shows that there's some forms they get in learning tasks quite readily. Others just take much longer. And given what we know about general skill acquisition, we should say maybe it's going to take them 10 years before they really sound like adults.
Right. I forgot to say that the last question is by Mary Rosa Espinosa. And
Okay.
as Carlos Alvarez is asking the following in English, I would like to ask Professor Clark the following question. Do adults provide different repair patterns to children with language pathologies? For example, specific language impairment.
I'm afraid I simply can't answer that because I don't know anything about the kinds of feedback that that parents give to children with any language problems.
Right. I have a question.
Okay.
I thought it was really interesting. The reformulation, the reformulations take place less and less over age.
Yes.
So, do you think the reformulation act as a kind of acquisitional function or strategy in conversation with young children? And the next one is a kind of reformulation. Are pragmatic or interactional practice such as reformulations or repetition of reformulated utterances a kind of bootstrapping, pragmatic bootstrapping, because you have shown a kind of a list of grammatical contexts where there's a kind of parading grammatical context.
Yeah, I mean, people in acquisition have used bootstrapping when they're talking about syntax only, typically. What we see with this is that it's phonology, morphology, syntax, and lexicon. So it looks as though it's very general across the whole language system rather than being specific. But I think that you could say that it's certainly a resource for children as they're acquiring language. But the one question I think we should ask is, do you get these sorts of prompts in every culture? And that I simply don't know. What I have looked at data from various languages, but they're all Western industrialized societies. I do know that in some of the Pacific Island cultures, parents spend a lot of time telling children what they should say to this person or that person. And it's very instructional. They will say, now you say, and then they will give something in the form of a quote. Whether the child says it or not, I'm not sure. That's a very different kind of feedback. But again, it's telling the child what's appropriate and what the form is to use. So I have a feeling there may be a lot of variations on this around. But I think that, one of the things that's interesting is for children, this may seem like a very reasonable way to hear from an adult what will make them more interpretable. That is, if they want something, if they say it this way, they're more likely to get it. If you think about it, I think one could not do this with, say, second language learners, because there is a loss of face for adults if they're told that what they've said is wrong. And so it's very delicate whether you correct even good friends in terms of how they say things and what they say on particular occasions that are in fact inappropriate or clumsy or ungrammatical. And so, you know, this is an interesting issue.
Well,
but I don't think I have any solution to it.
Thank you very, very much. I think this is all for today. We have another conference or round table soon after this one. We are so pleased. In the name of Adeline, I really thank you very much. Do you want to say something? And I thank the public for watching us.
No, all I would say is I would love to see more work on this kind of thing. Just looking at how interaction affects the progress in acquisition, I think is a very important aspect of what we look at both in normal children and children who have some kind of disorders. So, but I enjoyed very